You have information in your flyer about Mr. Ricks, but I would just add, for those of you who are interested, he graduated from Yale in 1977. He spent his career as a writer, a journalist, editor, educator, but focusing on areas of national defense. And he's currently at the Center for New American Security. And for those of you who were here maybe 6 weeks ago when Anne Marie Slaughter was here, she heads up that think tank. And so there is a linkage there in terms of their work together to deal with issues of foreign policy and defense. But tonight, the story is one of Mr. Ricks looking and trying to review the journalists, since he himself is a journalist, of the 20th century and who might have stood the test of time. And as far as he's concerned, George Orwell and Winston Churchill are the two that have stood the test of time. Their writing, their clarity, and most importantly, their ability to see that there is a joint effort of left and right to fight for freedom, to preserve freedoms of speech. And as he put it, Churchill helped give us a liberty we now enjoy. Orwell's thinking about liberty affects how we think about it now. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a wonderful Philadelphia welcome to Thomas Ricks and buy his book.
Let's keep it simple here. If you are not a relative of mine, please hold up your hand. Okay. The great thing about speaking in Philadelphia with all my relatives, and here is my cousins and friends of cousins and cousins of friends. This is as close as I'm ever going to come to seeing what my own funeral looks like. If only I could go to my own wake. Thank you for all coming out on such a rainy day. I was looking out the window about an hour and a half ago, and I thought nobody's going to come to this thing. I wouldn't come to this thing, except my publisher would get mad at me. I figured what I'd do is talk about 20 minutes or so, and then get into your questions and answers, which I think are the more interesting part of this kind of event. As that kind introduction said, this book for me began when I was looking at journalists in the 20th century. I actually was planning on writing a book about the Vietnam War at the time. There's no good history, military history of the Vietnam War. So it's really our least understood war. For example, a good book by a woman at the University of Kentucky, a Vietnamese-American refugee, now a professor of international relations, concludes that after 1966, neither Ho Chi Minh nor General Giap played any role in the conduct of the war. Yet those are the people we thought we were fighting. And in fact, General Giap so opposed the Tet Offensive that his staff officers were jailed in Hanoi in what later became the Hanoi Hilton. After 6 months, I decided that the only way I could write that book is if I learned to speak and read Vietnamese and was willing to live in Hanoi for 3 years doing interviews. And I thought I might, because I like Vietnamese food. But I didn't think my wife would be willing to leave the island in Maine, where we live. But during that time, I've been going back and reading a lot of 20th century journalists, trying to figure out why so many of them seemed irrelevant. H.L. Mencken, interesting stylist, but seemed like an anachronism to me, out of date, not speaking to any of my interest. E.B. White, wonderful writer, but his concerns are not mine. S.J. Perlman, not funny. Hemingway, blowhard. And then I picked up Orwell, and Orwell just seems so fresh and contemporary in his concerns, what he's thinking about, what is the relationship of the individual to the state. He's thinking the key question of the 20th century is not what Freud thought, the workings of the subconscious. It's not what Marx thought, the ownership of the means of production. The key question of the 20th century is how do you preserve individual liberty? in an era when the state is becoming more and more intrusive and surveillance threatens to become pervasive. What he didn't anticipate was corporate intrusion, corporate surveillance. But he saw a lot of this, and he begins thinking about it. And Churchill, a very different person, is thinking along the same lines from the right. Orwell is a socialist all his life. After the Spanish Civil War, when he saw the Stalinist, communists killing other leftists, because the biggest enemies to the Stalinists were others on the left. The fascists, they were just a problem. The Trotskyites, the anarchists, the socialists, they were the enemy. In fact, the NKVD, the predecessor of the KGB, built a crematorium on the outskirts of Barcelona, Spain, to dispose of the leftists whom they killed. Orwell was shocked by this, came back to England, read all the papers covering the war. He had been shot through the throat, had survived it, kind of miraculously. And during his recuperation, was reading the papers, and he said, nobody's telling the truth about this war. The right, he expected, the right-wing newspapers were making up stuff, but so were the left-wing newspapers. And so he breaks with the prevailing view, which is your choices are fascism or communism, and both you must toe the party line. You must promote opinion over facts. And Orwell says not only no, but hell no. That is not any way towards human liberation. That puts the state and the party over the individual, which of course becomes his book, 1984. Churchill is on a similar path. He's a conservative, yet during the 1930s, he almost goes into exile in his own party. He becomes very concerned by the rise of Nazi Germany, beginning with a speech in 1933 in the House of Commons, in which he says the key fact is that the Germans are rearming. And nobody in the British government wants to hear this. The conservatives are in power, and the conservatives have a policy called appeasement, which is we can't go to war right now. We don't have the weaponry to fight Germany. And even if we did, no one else in Europe would join us. So the smart money, they think, is pay off Germany, negotiate with Hitler, feed him little bits. And, regrettably, Czechoslovakia, tough luck, guys. You have to give up a chunk of Czechoslovakia. Oh, you have to give up a chunk of the space between France and Germany, they tell France. And Churchill becomes increasingly isolated, deeply resented by his own party. Chamberlain, when he becomes prime minister, says, I will not have that man in my cabinet. They keep him out. And in 36, 37, 38, Churchill is mocked as a washed-up, kind of foolish figure in the evening of his years as a politician. So here you have these two figures, and they are so different in so many ways. Part of the fun of writing this was Churchill is like a walking brass band. He just comes booming through like the Energizer Bunny. You're writing about Orwell, and Churchill just shows up banging things. Churchill is an extrovert, a bon vivant, bit of a drunk. One morning in World War II, he shows up, he's staying at the British Embassy in Cairo. And at the breakfast table, he asked his hostess, the ambassador's wife, for a carafe of white wine. And her eyebrows go up, and she says, no worries, madame, I've already had 2 whiskey sodas. Orwell was the opposite, introverted, quiet, increasingly withdrawn in his life, eventually moves to a windswept, treeless island off the west coast of Scotland. No good for his rotten lungs. He's self-denying, he's ascetic to the point of absurdity. One night during World War II, he came home and his wife had very nicely left him a plate of dinner. She'd also left a plate of food for the cat. he very absent-mindedly ate the cat's dinner of boiled eels. These two guys never met, which is kind of fascinating to me. Actually, an online magazine put up yesterday a piece I wrote, just for fun to think this through. What would have happened if Churchill and Orwell met? So I had them meet in heaven, and they have a short talk about what would have happened, how they conducted their lives, and so on. But they never met, but they admired each other from afar. Churchill was the only conservative politician that Orwell thought was worth a damn. He admired him. The hero of 1984, do you remember his first name? Winston. There was only one Winston in England at that time. All the other politicians were referred to by their last names: Attlee, Baldwin, Chamberlain. Churchill was referred to as Winston. By the way, bonus question. Anybody know John Lennon's middle name? October 9th, 1940. He's born during the Battle of Britain. And another interesting connection, my editor made me put these all in the footnotes. Said, Tom, we're not going down every rat hole in English history. Victory Mansions is where Winston Smith lives in 1984. It's based on the apartment building that Orwell lived in London just after the end of World War II. It's about a 3-minute walk from the Abbey Road studios. John Lennon was a big fan of George Orwell, but also, as a smart, young, semi-delinquent teenager, read Churchill's memoirs and enjoyed them as well. So there's all these odd connections, but they never met. The last piece that Orwell ever wrote, as he's dying of tuberculosis, coughing up chunks of his lungs, is an admiring review of Churchill's War Memoirs, Volume 2, in which he salutes Churchill's generosity of spirit, which I think is a wonderful phrase about that really captures who Churchill is. So I think the key question for both Churchill and Orwell is something that speaks to our own time. How do you preserve freedom? They had very concrete ways of doing this, and I think this is the takeaway, if you want one, from this evening. Don't assume you understand the situation. Go in with a kind of humble approach. Look at the facts, look at the details before you develop opinions. Then have established principles and apply your principles to those facts. And let that determine your course of action. And make facts more important than ideology. And one thing I want to emphasize that these two guys have in common is they were willing to blow the whistle on their own team, to criticize their own natural political allies. This is not a way to make friends. They antagonized a lot of people. H.G. Wells referred to Orwell as the Trotskyite with big feet, because Orwell criticized some of Wells' politics. Wells also wrote a letter to Orwell that began, "Read my early works, you little shit." So you don't make friends that way, but you do bring about long-term change. Have principles, find the facts, apply the two, and let the chips fall. And I want to conclude by talking about someone who did this. Martin Luther King Jr., in his letter from Birmingham jail, which you haven't read it, is a wonderful document. He's in jail in Birmingham in the early 1960s for marching, for asking the U.S. government and the government of Alabama to live up to its rhetoric, to allow black people to vote, to not use police violence to keep black people from voting or exercising their other rights. And it's amazing to me what he does. He begins, and he's read this newspaper article criticizing him in which white liberal, quote-unquote liberal, but moderate white religious figures in Alabama have criticized him for breaking the law and saying he's being too radical. And it's time, they said, for both sides to simmer down, as if the KKK and Martin Luther King were kind of equally at fault for the problem. And King is not given writing paper, so he writes this letter in the margins of the newspaper he has over the course of 3 days. And he begins with something that just warms my heart. What are the facts of the matter? The fact of the matter is, he writes, that Birmingham is the most segregated city in the United States. The second fact is that the Negro, he writes, is subjected to systematic official violence to prevent the Negro from enjoying the rights that they are supposed to have. And then he prescribes a course of action. This is solidly in the tradition of Churchill and Orwell, but also right in the middle of the Western tradition going back to Aristotle and Archimedes. Trying to see things as they are and then having principles that you apply to them. And that's, I think, the most inspirational thing I can give you today is have principles, learn the facts, and you can steer well. It's a little bit easier than I think it might appear to be, because in this country, unlike most countries, we have a written constitution that says what this country is, how it is supposed to work. The founding fathers in their wisdom devised, not many blocks from here, devised a way to prevent one person from having too much power. They don't want the military to have too much power. They don't want the executive to have too much power, so they design an adversarial system. Contention is not bad. It's part of the American system. But you also have the Bill of Rights. Freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And you have a special protection for the press. And so when a candidate knocks down a reporter, that's un-American. I can tell you, and it's not my opinion, I can say the Constitution says that's un-American. When a president cozies up to third world dictators, kings and autocrats, that's un-American. That's not what our Constitution says. That's not what the Bill of Rights is about. And when you have a president profoundly ignorant of the world and even of the U.S. Constitution, that's un-American. The good news is the system is working. This adversarial system, these judges are coming back and saying, no way, you can't do that. Another one just did it, I think the Fourth Circuit, just slam dunk Trump again on immigration issues. And again, he's finding he doesn't like this system. You know, my feeling is, yeah, the system's working. Thank you very much. Okay, now we have Q&A time. It has microphones, so you have to wait for the microphone to get there. Let's begin with my non-relatives.
How did Churchill come back into government after the Gallipoli disaster in World War I?
He doesn't really come back into government. He is was the First Lord of the Admiralty, I guess. He's basically the Secretary of the British Navy and has a role in designing the Gallipoli disaster down in Turkey, on the coast of Turkey during World War I. He feels he's been wrongly blamed for it. He certainly bears some of the blame. He goes into the military and serves honorably for 6 months as a battalion commander in the trenches. After 6 months, in which part of it is spent sending letters to his wife, ordering hams, Stilton cheeses, bottles of brandy, which he shares with his guys. But he really made sure, because it's not very far from London to the front, and they can just ship stuff over. And so he's, no more canned hams, he says. We just want some beefs now. He does that for about 6 months, but he really he spends really about 20 years without a solid base. He's kind of not sure what his political future is. And it gets not better and better, it gets worse and worse. He gets wiped out financially by the crash in '29. Churchill didn't inherit money, and he made his money as a writer, a journalist and a book writer. He wrote 15 million words during his lifetime. I'm not good at arithmetic, but I think that comes out to about 1,000 books, the equivalent of 1,000 books. Fortunately, he dictated a lot. He loved to dictate. He was very good at it. He comes back in simply because in the late 30s, it really becomes apparent that appeasement hasn't worked, that every time they've given Hitler another bite of some part of Europe, he chews on it for a while and then bites something else. And this becomes really evident. You have the Munich agreements in September 38, in which Chamberlain thinks he has, quote unquote, secured peace in our time. That's followed by just about 8 weeks later, Kristallnacht, which is the first great use of state violence against the Jewish population of Germany and Austria. And if you haven't read Kristallnacht, I really had not spent much time looking at that one event in November 38. It is stunning, and man, the Austrians misbehave even worse than the Germans. One thing that really haunts me as an image, so I'll tell you guys too. In Vienna, aging Jewish men and women, sort of the haute bourgeoisie, well-dressed intellectuals, professors, and so on, were herded into the park and made to climb into trees and tweet like birds. It just gives me the creeps. Neville Chamberlain, when he heard about all this, sighed and said, "I suppose I must say something in the House of Commons." Man, I mean, this guy's just not getting it. But it becomes evident in 39 that the policy of appeasement hasn't worked. The policy of appeasement didn't work because you cannot negotiate from a position of weakness like that. And some people have said that Obama appeased Iran. The big difference is we are negotiating with Iran from a position of strength. Iran has full knowledge that our military could wipe out theirs in about 3 weeks. And with the conventional military, there would still be guerrilla operations, Iranian Revolutionary Guard things. But, their tanks, their ships, their airplanes would go poof, and they know it. So I think there's a huge difference there. But appeasement of Hitler did not work. When that became evident, people looked around. There had only been one strong voice about this for years, and that was Winston Churchill. Even then, on May 10th, 1940 was the day Churchill became prime minister. The king wanted somebody else, Lord Halifax. And Halifax kind of knew he wasn't the right guy for the job. He'd been one of the architects of appeasement. And had Halifax gotten the job, he almost certainly would have negotiated peace with the Germans in the summer of 1940. Still thought it was the right thing to do. We would have had a peace settlement under which the Germans were allowed to have all of Europe in exchange for the British being allowed to retain their overseas colonial empire. And probably the first great battle of World War II was the battle that Hitler fought with Halifax in May 1940. And he concludes in a speech to the cabinet, "The Germans will get my surrender, never. What they will get is me lying on the ground with my voice being choked by my own blood." And he kind of said, "Gents, that's the way we're going to go here." He even said he would not flee to Canada, as some people talked about. He said, "No, I'm staying here no matter what." And it was a near-run thing in many ways. They actually expected the Germans to invade for much of 1940. A fact I didn't know is that in September 1940, there was a prearranged signal to be sent by radio across England if the German landings were perceived to be coming within hours. And it was just one word, Cromwell. That Cromwell word was broadcast on September 9th, 1940. They thought the Germans were coming that night.
I have two questions. One, I've just always wondered about Orwell. Why did he choose the year 1984, other than the fact that it was far in the distance? Is there something in your research that showed that? And my second question is about the power of great orators, which Churchill certainly was, and I suspect you think Martin Luther King was from what you said earlier. Who, if anyone, do you see today that might have those qualities, either in this country or elsewhere in the world?
Two interesting questions. 1984 is the year that Orwell wrote most of the book was 1948, and I think he inverted the numbers. And I think this especially because the book opens on April 13th, 1984, and it's the beginning of a very bleak world. Orwell's first wife died very suddenly on April 12th, a few years earlier. And I think April 13th was for him the beginning of this sad world after his wife is gone. Who today? One thing that the election of Trump has taught me is don't make predictions, and don't put too much faith in the workings of government. You got to have other places where your faith can reside. Otherwise, you're going to get crushed. There are interesting people out there today, and I would look for a couple of characteristics. As I indicated earlier, people who have principles and abide by them. For example, I've been waiting for one Republican to say, no, you don't go around beating up reporters. That's bad. And I hope I see somebody like that. The second thing is people who are willing to criticize their own side. And to that end, there's a group of people I'm paying really close attention to these days because I find their commentary very interesting. These are conservatives who refuse to get on the Trump train. Mainly it's writers right now. Elliot Cohen at Johns Hopkins, Charles Krauthammer, William Crystal, Jennifer Rubin, a conservative columnist for the Washington Post, Jeffrey Goldberg at The Atlantic. These people are writing some very interesting criticism. And it comes from an interesting perspective. They are genuine conservatives. They believe in the rule of law. They believe in tradition. They believe in a civil society. Yet, because of those principles, they now have more in common with, say, Bernie Sanders than they do with the Republican president. And I've talked to some of these people, and they find themselves kind of stunned and shocked at where they are. But those are some very interesting people right now with insights that I would never have because I'm not a conservative.
One of your earlier books was outstanding, was called The Generals, which I recommend to the audience. But I'm curious in your assessment of the generals that are part of the cabinet and advisors of President Trump. How long do you think they will put up with his leadership? And in particular, offer some observations about McMaster and whether he has compromised himself.
Generals in government. As a general principle, I don't like seeing a lot of generals in government. In this case, they're some of the only adults in the room. And if the choice is between a general and a Bannon, I'm going to take the general. They've had a mixed record even now. James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, I've known about 15 years. I think he's doing very well. He's keeping his head low. He's not getting involved in politics. And he is basically running a somewhat more conservative, aggressive version of Obama foreign policy. John Kelly, another Marine general, now Secretary of Homeland Security, a little bit more worrisome, less political instincts and more politicized. And I worry that, I wrote an op-ed piece actually for the New York Times back in, I think, in February, that worried that if you let these customs and immigration and border patrol guys think that, oh, now we can do whatever we want, you're going to get a lot of messes. And I worry that he hasn't realized that these are not a bunch of crack Marines. These are a bunch of sometimes very indisciplined people. I mean, I've heard stories of customs agents asking people, Americans, you watch Fox News or CNN? I mean, ooh. You know, my response would be, I just want to write down your badge number. And I got time. Detain me all you like, you know. But then the question is, by the way, you ask, am I being he'd say, I'll need you to sit over here. Say, am I being detained, is the response. Third general is Flynn. He blew up on the launch pad. And the fourth general is H.R. McMaster, who is an interesting figure. I've known H.R. since he was either a captain or a major, I can't remember. H.R. is a really interesting figure. He's very smart. He's not just a general, he's a smart general. And he's not just a smart general. He wrote one of the 10 best books in the Vietnam War called Dereliction of Duty. It's a study of how the generals of the Vietnam era failed to speak truth to power about the Vietnam War. So it's kind of Shakespearean to see the author of that book, an active duty lieutenant general, at the White House come out and carry water for the president. His job is not to protect the president, his job is to protect the nation. It's Sean Spicer's job to come out and lie. The problem is that Spicer has no credibility left. In fact, I don't think Spicer has a soul left at this point. He's just been crushed. I think Trump is a vampire of souls. He just consumes the spirits of people around him. So they sent out H.R. McMaster. And McMaster came out and he denounced a Washington Post story as false. The next day, he said, well, I meant the premise was false. That's a weasel word I have heard a lot in Washington. When you say the premise is false, it means I can't disagree with your facts, but I didn't like the story. And I think he gave up a little bit of his soul that day when he did it. Okay, the question is why? Why didn't he just say, take this job and shove it? I think the answer is because he thinks he is the only thing standing between a Bannonite Yahoo being National Security Advisor. If he steps down, who knows what Yahoo they're going to put in there. So he thinks he's serving the country by remaining in place. And I used to think that early on in the administration, but I've increasingly come to think all you're doing is putting lipstick on a pig. All you're doing is enabling Trump by making him look minimally competent. When in fact, we have a disastrously combination of reactionary and incompetent. On the other hand, I've become to think lately also that Trump's incompetence is his saving grace. Imagine what it would be like if he actually knew how to run the government. Bad things would be happening. But because he doesn't, we've kind of have done a nuclear decapitation strike on ourselves. We really don't have a president right now. We have someone who plays one on TV and tweets it. But he's not really a president. And what you're seeing is actually the U.S. government is pretty robust, pretty strong. You can remove the president, and these departments chunk along, you know. The government does things. The aircraft carriers steam around. Roads get paved. Education does whatever they do. The government's still chugging along. So actually, I actually have a little thanks that it's like watching The Godfather and somehow Fredo became the Godfather, not Michael. So I can live with President Fredo a little bit better than I can live with President Michael Corleone.
One of the more fascinating books I ever read, and I forget the title, but it was George Orwell's recollection of the Spanish Civil War, in which, of course, he joins as a socialist, and it was just phenomenal in the way he wrote it. But my curiosity is piqued based on what you said, because, of course, the two most well-known books that he wrote were 1984 and Animal Farm. Now, Animal Farm is, of course, is satire against, quote-unquote, equality as requested by the Communist Party or people on the left even today, the notion of this beautiful equality. And, of course, 1984 is against centralized government control, also a feature of the left more than the right. So my question is, why was he compelled to write those two books after that experience and being so dissatisfied with the anarchists and with the socialists and with the communists of the left? Why would he be compelled to write those two books pretty much nearly in the future?
It's a good question. But I disagree with the premise.
I knew you would.
Homage to Catalonia, I think is my favorite Orwell book. It's beautifully written, and it's one of the best accounts of war that I've read. It's a lot of fun. If you haven't read it, it's worthwhile. The dirty little secret of Orwell is, while he's a good writer, he's a terrible novelist. And several times in the course of working on this book, I went back and read, or tried to read some of the novels, and I just at some point said, no, I'm not going to take a bullet for the side here. These books are unreadable. His early novels, Coming Up for Air, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, A Clergyman's Daughter, they're just bad. So he's not a good natural novelist. Homage to Catalonia is a wonderful memoir. And the two novels we're talking about, Animal Farm and 1984, are not typical novels either. Animal Farm is a fairy tale. And that's the subtitle. It's Animal Farm, a Fairy Tale. But it's a tale of disenchantment. And it's a disenchantment with the communist. And we get so many great phrases from it. Remember, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. It's a funny book, too. If you haven't read it since high school, give yourself an evening and go back and read Animal Farm. You can read it in one night, really. One of my favorite parts is when the sheep, who are kind of morons, walk around chanting, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, all day long. And finally, the birds get mad. There's a lot of little stuff like that. Now, it turns horrible when Napoleon the pig gets tired of being criticized for keeping all the apples for the pigs. And the dogs has trained tear out the throats of the bunny rabbits and the sheep that complained. And it's like, okay, I'm not going to read it to the kids now. Likewise, 1984 is not a classic traditional naturalist novel. It's a horror story. It's like Frankenstein. But in 1984, the monster is the state. He was worried by these things, but he wasn't just worried by the left. He was worried. He came out of Spain saying fascism and communism have more in common with each other than they do with democracy. And this was like a priest getting up in the Vatican and saying, I'm not sure about all this resurrection stuff. I mean, the British left kind of freaked out. The Russians did worse. He had a hard time getting Animal Farm published, and one reason is that there were Soviet agents inside the British government who, on getting wind of this book, advised publishers that it would be wrong to publish it. T.S. Eliot, by the way, not only a poet but also an editor, turned down Animal Farm because he said, well, the pigs are smarter. Shouldn't they run the organization? Eliot was not a great Democrat either. So I think what we see with 1984 is while it was inspired very much by what he saw of communism, but also of fascism and Nazism, it's not just a Cold War story. It's a story about the abuse of power. And what's fascinating to me is a lot of people, even sort of fans of Orwell, thought that after the Cold War was over, that Orwell would kind of disappear. And the interesting thing is Orwell, over the last 20 years, has had a great boom. Orwell never made much money in his life. His estate is now making $10 million a year on his books. Over 50 million copies of 1984 have been sold. It keeps on showing up on bestseller lists. There are 18 editions in Chinese of 1984. I don't know how they're doing it. Somebody in the Chinese government might want to look at the book. Well, that's one of the messages is power corrupts. Well, bingo. Well, it takes us back to the Constitution. The Founding Fathers said, let's have an adversarial system in which no one element has too much power. A document written, by the way, in reaction to the English Civil War.
In regard to Orwell, in the Second World War, did he have any influence in regard to the attitude and position of England? You know, we know about Churchill, or was it just his books that later became influential? It's
a good question. Orwell actually had very little influence during his lifetime. Animal Farm is published about 3 days after World War II ends in Europe, 1945, and 1984 comes out 4 years later. He dies a year after that in 1950 at the age of 47. He was really a fairly minor figure during his own time. For example, I went back and looked at the edition of Bartlett's Quotations published, I think it was 50 or 52, and there's like one quote from Orwell. This is a guy who we now know phrases from: doublethink, Big Brother, memory hole, war is peace, ignorance is strength. This is a guy who has contributed to our political vocabulary, not recognized in his own time. It's quite striking that Orwell has so little influence in his own time. Though I think he would have some problems with fame and so on. He didn't like even the fame he was achieving then. That's one reason he moved to the island off of Scotland. Another reason was that he feared that the Soviets would try to kill him as they'd killed some of his friends in Spain. And he actually carried a pistol in the last few years of his life. So yeah, he was a gun nut too.
So Orwell was originally named Eric Blair, and he changed it to George Orwell. What was the reason, and does the name Orwell have any special meaning?
I think he doesn't really explain it anywhere, but George is the most common of English names, and Orwell was a river near where he lived at the time. And I think he just decided that would be a nice pseudonym. He actually played with a couple of others. They don't resonate at all. Like one was like, William Bradley. Who cares? Orwell's an unusual enough name, so nobody else is named Orwell. It also made my Google search when I was writing the book much easier. There's an Orwell in New York. I know a lot about real estate in Orwell, New York now, too. This guy in the middle here.
Thank you for being here tonight. The year's
It's a pleasure. It's like Thanksgiving,
I saw you on Joe Scarborough this morning. You were excellent. The years 1938, 1939, 1940. Do we have a written record of what Joseph P. Kennedy and Churchill thought of each other?
Have you read my book? Yeah.
No.
Oh.
Second, well, just take a wild guess. Where's the North Korea issue in 5 years? I know that's a...
Yeah, we're going to end this on a high note. Joe Kennedy is one of the villains of this book. Yeah. Joe Kennedy was U.S. ambassador to London in the late 30s. And kind of thought the Nazis were onto something. And thought Britain was washed up. He thought democracy was washed up. And he thought the smart thing would be to either ally with the Nazis or at least have a peace treaty with them. And he's really the negative Nelly walking around London. In the middle of the Battle of Britain, I think it's about August of 40, he's walking on the street and German planes are actually flying like overhead and stuff. And he turns to a friend and says, I'll bet you good money that Hitler's going to be sitting in Buckingham Palace in 6 weeks. Why is he kept in place? Well, because FDR was a very smart politician and didn't want Kennedy running against him and thought it's always better to have the guy inside the tent pissing out, as Lyndon Johnson said. He tolerated Kennedy just barely. But a key moment comes on September 11th, 1939. Even before Churchill is prime minister, they've brought him into the cabinet. The war's begun a week earlier. And on September 11th, 1939, Joe Kennedy, U.S. ambassador to England, sends a triple, all bells and whistles, high-level important alert to the president. The United States says we really need to negotiate a peace treaty with the Nazis. That very same day, President Franklin Roosevelt contacts Winston Churchill, who's just a cabinet member, and says, I think you and I need to have a private channel here. I think he did it specifically to find a way to get around Kennedy, who was poisoning the well. And over the next 5 years, I think it's about, I can't remember the number, several thousand messages are exchanged between the two. I've read them as 4 collected volumes. They're really interesting. Churchill establishes, or Roosevelt establishes this back channel to Churchill. And then, as soon as Roosevelt has won his unprecedented third term in November 1940, 2 weeks later, he fires Kennedy. Kennedy comes back to New York, staying at the Waldorf Astoria. First, he's in Boston, and he tells a bunch of reporters off the record, England is finished and democracy is finished. One of the reporters claims he didn't understand the rules and publishes it. It's not clear to me what happened there. I think probably Kennedy wanted it out. Then he goes to New York. He's staying at the Waldorf Astoria, and FDR invites him up to the Roosevelt House in Hyde Park, New York, for the day. Actually, for the weekend. He's invited to stay for the weekend. Kennedy arrives and sits down with FDR in FDR's study. And he's supposed to stay for the weekend, remember. After 10 minutes, FDR wheels him out. He wheels himself out, finds Eleanor Roosevelt and says, get that son of a bitch out of here. I never want to see him again. And she says, but Franklin, you invited him for the weekend. He says, take him to your cottage, she had her own little cottage, and give him a sandwich or something and then put him on the train. Which is what she did. She later described it as 4 of the worst hours of her life. Kennedy then hops the train back to New York City, goes to the Waldorf Astoria, and sits down with Charles Lindbergh. I love some of these narrative chunks. It's just so juicy. By the way, Joe Kennedy continues to be a poisonous figure in American politics for a couple of decades after that. One of the, when I was doing some of my research, one of my favorite moments I was reading about, so relevant to the book, is when he was in Illinois in 1959 trying to set up vote buying with the unions. There was a real problem because a bunch of guys said, Joe Kennedy, you're the guy who, when we used to sell us, we'd buy from you convoys of bootleg liquor up in Canada, and then you'd have your guys hijack the convoys back. We're going to, how can we trust you to sell the votes? Oh, sorry, North Korea, sorry. North Korea, I actually think there's about a 40% chance that we will have a nuclear strike against North Korea in the next 12 months. Nuke, yeah. To be specific, you don't spend 20 years as a Pentagon reporter and not learn anything. Low-yield B-61 bombs, deliverable by F-22s and F-35s. They are, the problem in nuking North Korea's weapon systems has always been the fallout problem. Huge clouds, nuclear clouds descending on South Korea and flying eastward into Japan. These low-yield bombs solve a lot of that, very little fallout, very little radioactivity actually. And a couple of academics just had an estimate in International Security magazine that you could do this basically with about 20 bombs. But the prevailing winds move eastward. Yeah. Okay, we got time for one more. This is what a friend of mine calls the double-hander. This is, if somebody's going to go home tonight cranky and kick the dog because you didn't get to ask your question, put up 2 hands.
I actually have 2 questions, but the second one, is too open-ended. First one, you mentioned a bunch of things that are un-American that we've seen recently. Where would you place the Electoral College in terms of how we should feel toward that? Second question, what actually would have been prescribed by Churchill as the path forward in 1933, to just spend more and be prepared as quickly as possible for the conflict that he was certain was going to come, or, I mean, to actually go to war with them to knock the Nazi regime out? I mean, how far? Because when you think of it, it gets really problematic to start a war, even given how horrible the Nazis were.
On the Electoral College, the short answer is I don't know, but I'd be careful of dispensing with the wisdom of the Founding Fathers. I'm really fond of some of that parts of the Constitution. On war, what Churchill would prescribe was, yes, more spending, especially on fighter aircraft for defense. An interesting point here is, had you acted earlier against Hitler, Hitler was much weaker. The big move that I think emboldened Hitler was taking the Rhineland in violation of the Versailles Treaty, and then actually breaking all the limits of the Versailles Treaty, limiting the size of the German military. A key lesson here, though, is Hitler became enormously more powerful as a result of the expansions. The German treasury did not have a lot of gold. The Austrian treasury did. And when they took Austria and the Anschluss, they got that gold. The Germans didn't have as many weapons factories as they needed. When they took Western Czechoslovakia, they got the big Czech arms factories. And the third thing they got was people. Soldiers, cannon fodder. The French had lost a generation in World War I, so had the Germans to a great deal. But the quick expansion gave them people they could press into military service. So the Hitler of 1940 is much stronger than the Hitler of 35. And one of the lessons is, don't negotiate from weakness, but also consider action earlier rather than later. Thank you very much.